Welcome to the High Court in Pretoria on day 4 of the Oscar Pistorius murder trial. Today the court heard some powerful evidence from a near neighbour who was one of the first on the scene on the night the Olympian shot Reeva Steenkamp. Dr. Johan Stipp recounted how he found Pistorius trying to revive his stricken girlfriend, praying for her to live and promising to dedicate his life to God if she survived. And according to Dr. Stipp, his first words to him that night were, "I thought she was a burglar and I shot her." Well, in court, Pistorius listened to this testimony with his head in his hands. The athlete on trial, of course, for murder and for several firearms offences. Paul Harrison reports.
Unlike before in this still young murder trial, the media gave Oscar Pistorius plenty of room as he arrived at court.
Thanks, guys. Thanks.
More than likely, it was because of this tweet from Oscar Pistorius' brother Carl, in which he celebrates the life of their mother, who died 12 years ago today, when the Olympian was just 15. And for the first time in this trial, the families of the accused and victim beside each other. Emotional and speaking softly, the athlete's sister, Amy Pistorius, on the right, appeared to reach out to members of the Steenkamp family. Oscar Pistorius, meanwhile, prepared to hear neighbour radiologist Johan Stipp tell the court about the moment he arrived at the scene to find Reeva Steenkamp already dead and Pistorius by her side.
I remember that I was awakened by 3 loud bangs. And I remember my wife asking me, what was that? And I said, I think it's gunshots. So I got up out of bed and I walked to the balcony. And as I looked out, trying to ascertain where the shots, whatever it was coming from, I heard screaming. Now, it sounded to me like the voice of a female, and she screamed 3 or 4 times. And when I heard that, I knew there was big problems here.
What did you do then?
I went back inside the bedroom and I phoned the Silverwood security. They didn't answer, so I phoned 10111. I think the number must be out of order. I got a funny dialing tone. While I was still busy on the phone, thinking what number to dial next, I heard another 3 loud bangs.
What did you think that was?
Well, I thought that whoever shot the first time was starting to shoot again, and I told my wife to get away from the window.
Why?
Well, I thought that if it was shooting, there may be some bullets come flying our way. So I wanted her to get out of the way. I walked out on the balcony again to see if I can see any movement, anything like that. And that's when I heard a man's voice shouting 3 times, "Help, help, help."
Johan Stipp then explained he moved back inside the house after calling for security. When they arrived, from his balcony, he pointed them in the direction of the house opposite, just 70 metres away.
I went out on the other balcony again, watching them as they went. And as I was standing there, I looked up again towards where the lights were on, and the noises where it came from. And I noticed that someone was moving in the bathroom through the window from the right to the left.
Which bathroom window was that now?
It was the bathroom of the accused house.
And the condition of the light?
Well, it looked the same as before. There weren't any more lights on. It was just the one.
The lights were on there?
Yeah.
And you saw somebody move in the bathroom?
Yes, I got a distinct impression of a person moving from the right to the left.
Having discussed it with his wife, together they decided he should go to the scene to see if he could help.
I went towards the front door. There was a lady standing in the door. And I said, "I'm a doctor. Can I maybe be of assistance? Can I help?" And then she said yes, and she showed me inside to the bottom of the stairs where there was a lady lying on her back on the floor. As I approached the lady, there was a man on his knees on the left side. He had his left hand on the right groin and his right hand's second and third fingers in her mouth. And I remember the first thing he said when I got there was that he said, "I shot her. I thought she was a burglar and I shot her." The next thing I did was I tried to assist her. So I tried to open the airway and to look for any signs of life. She had no pulse in her neck. She had no peripheral pulse. She had no breathing movements that she made. She was clenching down on Oscar's fingers as he was trying to open her airway. I tried to do a jaw lift maneuver to open the airway. It was very difficult with the clenching down. And all during that time, there wasn't any signs of life that I could see. I opened her right eyelid. The pupil was fixed, dilated, and the cornea was milky. In other words, it was already drying out. So to me it was obvious that she was mortally wounded. I looked at the rest of her body and I noted that she had a wound in the right thigh, also a wound in the right upper arm. As I looked further, I saw there was blood and hair and what looked like brain tissue intermingled with that to the right high parietal area of her skull.
And is that what one can see on paragraph 133?
Yes, that's right. On the top of her skull, that's where I saw the brain tissue and the blood.
Yes, and then what happened?
Well, during that time, while I was trying to ascertain if she is survivable, Oscar was crying all the time. He prayed to God to please let her live. She must not die. He said at one stage while he was praying that he will dedicate his life and her life to God if she would just only live and not die that night. When I saw that, I couldn't do anything for her because I thought when I arrived there, maybe if you can just hold down a wound or stop bleeding, that could help. But she was way too seriously injured for that. Oscar stayed by her side most of the time. I remember at one stage while I was outside, I was talking to Mr. Stander, and I noticed that Oscar was going up the stairs. And I asked Mr. Stander if he knew where the gun was, because it was obvious that Oscar was emotionally very, very upset. And I didn't know the situation in the house, so I thought maybe he was going to hurt himself. And Mr. Stander said he didn't know where the gun was. A few minutes later, Oscar returned down the stairs.
Does that look familiar?
Yes, that is the lady that I tried to assist.
But it was as Prosecutor Nell and the witness analysed photographs of Reeva Steenkamp's body that Oscar Pistorius became extremely emotional. His head drops, he begins to retch, and is later passed a plastic bag. When it was clear nothing else could be done to help the 29-year-old model, Mr. Stipp moved outside Mr. Pistorius' house.
I was talking to Mr. Stander. At one stage, I think his wife arrived. Mr. Stander's daughter was also on the scene at that time. So we were talking. I don't really remember the specifics about what we were talking about. Only that they were concerned about what happened. And I think especially Mr. Stander's wife said that she hopes this doesn't get out to the papers. The next morning, I went to work as usual. My wife phoned at about 9 o'clock that morning, the 14th. And she said, "Do you know the lady that was shot this morning? It turns out to actually be Oscar Pistorius' girlfriend, and that you were in Oscar Pistorius' house." And I was very surprised because I couldn't believe it.
And towards the end of Mr. Nell's initial questioning, he asked the witness to once again return to the screams he heard.
There were repeated screams, like I said, 3 or 4 times. And she sounded in severe emotion, anguish, scared, almost scared out of her mind, I would say.
Dr. Stipp insisted he heard 2 volleys of gunshots. But as you're about to see, Pistorius' own defence lawyer, Barry Rue, had a very different explanation.
Doctor, what is significant, and I'm going to put to you, the last 2 to 3 sounds, according to your statement, those sounds were caused by a cricket bat breaking down a door. But it sounded to you, again, like gunshots.
It did sound like gunshots, yes. It sounded, well, identical to the first 3 I heard.
Yes. And we know one thing, in the state's own case, there were shots fired, 4 shots, and no other shots. 4 shots. There was a fatal wounding of the deceased, causing her to have no cognitive functions, no response functions, no thought process. So what I'm saying, are you with me this far?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm
Yes.
with you.
So what I'm saying to you, when you heard screams, it could not have been, it's medically impossible, could not have been the accused. The deceased.
The screams I heard definitely sounded female to me.
Can his voice resemble a woman screaming?
I don't know, can it?
We will call an expert who will come and tell the court the surprise of him screaming and that it sounds just like a woman.
It would be curious though, because I heard, like I recall, I said the woman screaming, but also intermingled, I also heard a man. So am I to believe that he was screaming in 2 voices or 2 tones?
One of the notable features of the trial so far has been the dogged and pugnacious questioning of Barry Rue. In contrast, the prosecution lawyer, Harry Nell, has been a virtual bystander. But on the issue of whose screams were heard that night, the pair finally crossed swords.
There was fatal wounding, and that's in accordance with my experts.
Yes, you're correct.
So what we know as a fact, it could not have been the deceased.
Lady, I have to object. We take it as a fact that the first shots killed the deceased. Because that is the only way Mr. Rue can say it could not have been the deceased. It's not according to the state's case. Mr. Rue can argue that, but he can't put to this witness as a fact that after the first shots, the screams could not have been the deceased. It's our case, it was. So, he can say, on their version it was, but not as a fact.
If it's the state's case that there were later on, after the first 4 shots, other shots fired, he must tell us that, because we have not a statement, we have statements from the police, from the ballistics, only 4 shots. We have statements by state witnesses telling us about the succession of the shots, how far apart. We have no other statements that after those shots, and not first shots, the real shots, that there were no other shots fired other than the 4 shots. No other shots. So if the state tells us that there were first shots and later shots, then we have a difficulty because we have no such statement, and I would ask the state to make it available.
Lady, I'm not obliged to answer the questions of counsel. What I will do is say, however, it's the state's case that it was the deceased that screamed. how we'll argue and what we'll do will become clear. But, my lady, if it's not common cause, and if it's still the state's case as I stand here, that the person that screamed was the deceased, then it could not be put as a fact. And that's my objection, my lady. Counsel puts to this witness as a fact that it could not have been deceased. I say, on the state's case, it was so.
Yes. Thank you.
Before proceedings ended for the day, Barry Rue asked Dr. Stipp to comment on whether Pistorius' grief on that night really seemed genuine.
Doctor, what I want to invite you to share with the court is the emotional state of the accused when you arrived at his house and you went inside.
He was kneeling by his side, as I said before, and he was crying. He was praying, he was talking to God, he was telling God to please let her live, please don't let her die. He was making promises to God. He was trying to, I don't know, maybe get atonement. But he was very, very distraught, severely so.
Would you say it was sincere, or would you say it was like someone was just pretending to the outside world?
He looked sincere to me. He was crying, there were tears on his face.
But it looks like Dr. Stipp is going to face some more tough questions from Barry Rue tomorrow morning when day 5 starts here at the High Court. Let's get a view on how it all went today. I'm joined now by Gia Nicolaides, who's a reporter at Eyewitness News here in South Africa, and Martin Brunt, our own crime correspondent. Gia, that was some day, wasn't it? I mean, we had drama, we had distress, we had tears in court, and some very, very powerful and vivid evidence.
Absolutely, and I think that it's the first time we've seen Oscar Pistorius break down in the way that he did today. I mean, holding his head in his hands, bowing down, then taking a tissue and wiping his face with those tears. And all that emotion was triggered from Stipp's testimony. And I think it's the first time that we've actually heard a personal account of someone walking in and actually witnessing what had actually happened just a few moments before. So he saw Reeva Steenkamp's body lying on the floor. He tried to help. He tried to assist and tried to revive her in some way. But after checking her vitals, her pupils, he said he lifted her eyelids. He said to him it was obvious that she had died from that fatal wound to her head. An interesting thing, though, that he did mention, and it wasn't brought up again during the trial, is that he noticed Oscar Pistorius went up the stairs and then returned 2 minutes later. What was Oscar Pistorius doing at that particular time? And I'm sure that we'll get those answers perhaps tomorrow. But it's very interesting to me because he said he wondered where the gun was. And the fact that he had removed himself from Reeva Steenkamp's body and then moved upstairs for a short space of time brings up a whole bunch of extra questions that I think need to be answered.
Dr. Stipp was clearly worried about the state of mind Pistorius was in. He was obviously very distraught, as he said, and he's wondering what he's going to do if he hasn't seen the gun around.
Yes, he'd already described how he was crying throughout most of this episode. He also described him praying to God to say, look, if she survives, I will dedicate my life and her life to your work. He was clearly in a very emotional state. And then he turned to the other man who was there and said, where's the gun? He's gone upstairs. I'm worried that he's going to hurt himself.
I thought what was interesting was the fact that for the first time today, over this whole question of what Dr. Stipp saw, and particularly before he ran over the road, when he said he heard gunshots that had woken him up and screams, that the two lawyers, the state prosecutor and the defence, finally went head-to-head. They had a real row, didn't they?
Absolutely, and I think the real question here, or the real issue that they were fighting about in court, is the fact about the gunshots versus the sound of the cricket bat used to break down the bathroom door. And it's quite obvious that the state doesn't believe Barry Rue's version of events, and Barry Rue is trying so hard to convince the court that all these neighbours, not just Dr. Stipp, actually heard right near the end the sound of the cricket bat. And what was quite interesting is Dr. Stipp said, but then how come did the sound at the end sound exactly like the first gunshot that I heard. And I thought that was rather interesting, because surely there must be a distinction between the sound of a gunshot and the sound of a cricket bat being used to break down a wooden door.
Martin, do you sense we're hearing the kind of crux of the case now, really, this timeline leading up to the moment that Dr. Stipp finally went in and found Reeva dead?
I think it's going to be a crucial thing, which presumably is why the prosecution has begun with it. But I think it's getting already rather confusing. I mean, perhaps it's good that there's a judge here who's probably more used to disentangling the confusing bits of evidence. If it was a jury here, I think they would be having real trouble trying to follow that timeline that Barry Roux is trying to establish.
Martin, Gia, thank you both very much for having a look at the evidence in court on day 4. And it's been a day of drama and great distress as well. And on the day that Oscar Pistorius was remembering his mother, who was a great inspiration in his life, who died 12 years ago today, he clearly felt the stress in court, breaking down in tears more than once and being comforted by his younger sister Amy. And very nearby, we also saw the Steenkamp family looking on and holding each other as well, trying to hug and comfort each other as they heard this very powerful and very vivid and very distressing evidence today in court. Day 5 starts 7:30 tomorrow morning on Sky News. We'll be live throughout the day, and of course a special programme each weekday evening at 9:30. So do join us tomorrow for the Oscar Pistorius trial.